One of the things that immediately stands out in Resident Evil Requiem is just how real the environments feel. Not just visually impressive, but believable. The materials look real, the lighting feels grounded, and every object seems carefully placed. But what's interesting is that this realism isn't accidental. It's the result of very deliberate environment art techniques used in AAA development. And once you start noticing them, you see them everywhere. Today, we're going to break down why Resident Evil Requiem looks so real and what environment artists can learn from it. If you're new to the channel, I break down how games are actually built, from environment art, lighting, to production techniques used inside game studios. I've been working in game art for the past 6 years and as a 3D artist in other fields for another 6 years. If you're trying to improve your portfolio or understand how modern game environments work, you're in the right place. When players say a game looks realistic, they usually think it's about graphics power. But in reality, realism in games comes from something much more subtle. It's about layers of detail working together. Surface materials, object placement, lighting interaction, and environmental storytelling. Games like Resident Evil Requiem don't rely on a single trick. They combine dozens of small decisions that collectively create believable spaces, and environment artists control almost all of them. I also have to mention the amazing sound design. Even though it's not the job of environment artists, it contributes greatly to make the world come to life. One of the biggest contributors to realism in Resident Evil environments is material complexity. Real-world surfaces are never perfectly uniform. Concrete has subtle roughness variation. Paint slowly wears away. Moisture accumulates in corners. In AAA pipelines, materials are designed to include multiple layers of variation. You often have base material detail, microsurface noise, dirt overlays, edge wear, and roughness variation. These subtle differences are what makes surfaces feel real instead of flat. And if you remove them, the illusion disappears instantly. Now let's take a look at this sequence which illustrates all of this brilliantly. So now we have many things to notice in this sequence. So first of all, as soon as Grace opens the door, there's obviously this curtain and the light on the ceiling that starts to move. Immediately after, we can see how the light behaves in this broken mirror. This catches the eye. Then as we move forward in the corridor, we can see on the left the detail of the material on the walls. Then as we progress further, we can appreciate the complexity of the floor material. So this is a very complex material with many layers, and there's probably some decals over it, some objects also, and we can see some reflection in the water. Then we see the double door with the very dirty glass, and we can see how the light behaves, is reflected, and how we can appreciate all the roughness variation. Another important ingredient is micro detail. When you look at real objects closely, they're full of tiny imperfections. Dust collects along edges. Scratches appear where objects are handled. Materials chip and wear over time. AAA environment artists intentionally add these details because our brains expect them. Without micro detail, objects start to look like plastic props. But with them, they begin to feel grounded in reality. Real environments are rarely empty. They're full of objects that accumulate over time. Furniture, boxes, papers, tools. Resident Evil environments are incredibly dense with props, but the key is control density. Objects aren't randomly scattered. They're placed intentionally to support both the visual storytelling and the gameplay readability. This careful balance is what makes the spaces feel lived in rather than staged. At first glance, scenes like this look incredibly realistic. But what's interesting is how fragile that realism actually is. If we start removing just a few details, first we remove surface variation, then we remove some decals, then we remove prop density, and finally we simplify the lighting. Suddenly the entire scene starts to look like a video game again. The realism wasn't coming from one big feature. It was coming from dozens of small layers working together. And one of the most powerful of those layers is something players almost never consciously notice: lighting behavior. If you're learning from these videos but struggling to put everything together into a full environment, that's exactly why I built my full course. You'll build the entire scene step by step in real time, understanding composition, scale, materials, and lighting, so you can apply the same process to your own world. These environments were created by students using the same workflow you'll learn here. It's designed for artists who already know the basics and want to create portfolio-level work, not just isolated studies. This isn't about learning tools, it's about learning how professionals build environments. If that's where you're trying to get to, you can check it out in the description. Lighting is one of the most important elements in making an environment feel believable. And in games like Resident Evil Requiem, lighting does far more than just illuminate the scene. It defines how every surface in the world behaves, because materials only look realistic when light interacts with them correctly. In the real world, every surface reflects light differently. A rough concrete wall scatters light in many directions. Polished metal surface reflects it sharply, and wet surfaces create soft highlights that shift as the camera moves. AAA lighting systems are designed to reproduce these behaviors in real time, which means that when light hits a material in the game, the engine calculates how that surface should respond. This is why lighting movement is so important. When the player walks through an environment, highlights shift across surfaces, reflections change, shadows evolve dynamically. These subtle changes are something our brains instantly recognize from real life, and when they're missing, the environment starts to feel artificial. Another key aspect of lighting in Resident Evil environments is contrast. Instead of lighting everything evenly, artists use strong directional lighting and shadows. This does two things. First, it enhances the mood and atmosphere. But just as importantly, it helps define the shape and depth of the environment. Shadows reveal the structure of objects and surfaces. They make geometry feel grounded in space. Without shadow contrast, even highly detailed environments can feel flat. Modern AAA engines also use techniques like volumetric lighting. This allows light to interact with particles in the air, such as dust or fog. When light passes through these volumes, you begin to see beams and soft diffusion effects. These subtle atmospheric details help reinforce the physicality of the space. They make the environment feel less like a digital level and more like a real location filled with air and atmosphere. When all of these lighting elements come together, directional light, material interaction, dynamic shadows, and atmospheric effects, the result is an environment that feels grounded and believable. And in games like Resident Evil Requiem, lighting isn't just a visual feature. It's one of the key tools environment artists use to turn a collection of assets into a world that feels real. One of the most important reasons environments in this game feel so believable is something that goes far beyond textures or lighting. It's environmental storytelling. In great AAA environments, every location tells a story, even before a single line of dialogue is spoken. Instead of placing props randomly, environment artists carefully arrange objects to suggest what happened in that space. A chair knocked over, a drawer left open, documents scattered across the floor. Individually, these are small details, but together they form a narrative. This is one of the key differences between environments that look technically good and environments that feel alive. In real life, spaces accumulate history. People move objects, furniture gets used, surfaces wear down over time. Environment artists try to reproduce that same sense of lived-in history. That's why you'll often see subtle signs of use across an environment. Edge wear on frequently touched objects, scratches near doors, dust collecting in corners. These small imperfections are critical because perfectly clean environments rarely exist in the real world. Environmental storytelling also works at the level of composition. Artists place objects intentionally to guide the player's attention. A trail of scattered items might lead toward a doorway. A broken wall might reveal something important in the next room. These visual cues help players navigate the environment without even realizing it. In horror games especially, this type of storytelling becomes incredibly powerful. The environment itself builds tension. A dark hallway, an abandoned room, signs that something happened here, but you're not quite sure what. By the time the player arrives, the environment has already set the tone. This is why environment art in games like Resident Evil Requiem isn't just about building visually impressive spaces. It's about creating environments that communicate silently, spaces that feel like they existed before the player arrived, and spaces that continue to tell stories long after the player has moved on. What makes AAA environments feel realistic is imperfection. Perfect surfaces look artificial. Perfect symmetry feels unnatural. So environment artists deliberately introduce subtle irregularities, slight rotation changes in props, variation in texture tiling, small damage patterns. These imperfections make environments feel organic instead of manufactured. So when we look at environments in Resident Evil Requiem, it's easy to focus on the visual quality, the detailed materials, the dense prop placement, the cinematic lighting. But for environment artists, the real value comes from understanding the principles behind those visuals. Because what makes these environments work isn't just technical skill. It's intentional design decisions applied consistently across the entire environment. Every element serves a purpose. Materials define how surfaces react to light. Props add narrative context and visual complexity. Lighting guides the player's attention and establishes mood. And composition ties everything together into a coherent space. When all of these layers work together, the result is an environment that feels believable and immersive. One of the biggest lessons for aspiring environment artists is that realism rarely comes from a single impressive asset or hero asset. It comes from the relationship between many assets working together. A single high-quality prop won't make an environment feel realistic, but dozens of carefully arranged elements, all supporting the same visual language, can transform a scene completely. Another key lesson is control complexity. AAA environments are incredibly detailed, but that detail is carefully organized. Prop density increases near focal points. Important areas receive more visual attention. Background spaces are simplified to maintain clarity and performance. This balance is essential because too little detail makes environments feel empty, but too much detail can make them chaotic and difficult to read. The final lesson is something many beginners overlook. Great environments are designed not just as static images, but as spaces the player will move through. Artists constantly think about how environments will look from different camera angles, how lighting will change as the player walks through the scene, how composition guides the player from one area to the next. In other words, they're designing experiences, not just assets. When all of these principles come together, materials, lighting, storytelling, and composition, the result is what we see in Resident Evil Requiem. Environments that don't just look impressive in screenshots, but feel believable when you explore them in motion. And for environment artists, studying games like this is one of the best ways to understand how modern AAA environments are built. And once you start noticing these design decisions, it completely changes the way you look at the game environments. Resident Evil Requiem looks realistic not because of a single technical breakthrough, but because every part of the environment is carefully crafted. Materials behave correctly, objects feel intentional, lighting reinforces the physical world, and together, these systems create environments that feel believable. And that is the real goal of AAA environment art, not just to look impressive, but to feel real. If you're trying to break into the game industry as an environment artist, one of the biggest challenges is knowing what studios actually expect to see in a portfolio. So I created a free AAA environment art portfolio checklist. It breaks down the exact elements studios look for when reviewing environment art portfolios. You can download it using the link in the description. And if you'd like more breakdowns of how video games are actually built, subscribe to the channel, because every week we explore the techniques behind modern game development. And a quick thank you to the members supporting the channel. Your support helps make these videos possible.